In a high-ceilinged briefing room tucked behind thick, soundproofed doors at the Ministry of Defense, 6 Soviet generals stared silently at a flickering television set. It was nearly midnight. A bottle of Georgian cognac sat untouched on the sideboard. The screen, tuned to CNN, showed a surreal image, a green-tinted desert landscape, grainy and glowing. Black silhouettes of tanks crawled across the bottom of the frame. A crosshair hovered mid-screen. The audio was off. Then one of the silhouettes erupted into a bloom of white flame. No warning, no trail, no time. Another tank followed, gone in a flash, as if the desert itself had consumed it. Then another. The feed panned left, following what must have been the source of the fire. Invisible, off-screen, unthreatened. The camera wasn't shaky. It was stabilized, tracking, calculated. The CNN anchor, speaking over the scene in calm American English, called it historic. Live FLIR footage from a U.S. Army unit operating deep inside Iraqi territory. Abrams tanks, first confirmed engagement with Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard. The Soviet generals watched in silence as one T-72 attempted to turn. Its turret rotated left, barely halfway into position, when a flash consumed the screen. When the dust settled, only the lower hull remained. Burning. No return fire. No visible enemy. Just thermal annihilation, captured in real time. One of the generals reached forward and slowly turned up the volume. These images were captured just hours ago, the anchor continued, from the forward units of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Iraqi forces, believed to include T-72 main battle tanks, were engaged at ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. No U.S. casualties reported. That number, 2,500 meters, hung in the air like a gunshot. It was twice the effective range of the T-72's main gun. Another tank exploded on screen. No smoke trail was visible, no arc from a shell. Just sudden terminal light. The Soviet generals said nothing. But their posture shifted. A few leaned forward, others folded arms tighter. One scratched a note into a leather-bound notebook. They weren't watching a battle. They were watching a burial, and the coffin had a Soviet serial number. 6 months earlier, inside a secured hall at the Kubinka Tank Museum just outside Moscow, a group of senior officers gathered for a confidential briefing on the likely impact of U.S. tanks in a hypothetical Middle East conflict. At the front of the room, a colonel from the main armored directorate of the Ministry of Defense pointed at slides projected from an old carousel machine. Photographs of the American M1 Abrams, captured during intelligence-gathering operations in West Germany, filled the wall. The colonel, confident and precise, reassured the room that despite all Western boasting, the tank had clear vulnerabilities. Too heavy for rapid maneuver, he began. High fuel consumption, and its turbine engine, excellent for performance, terrible for logistics. There were murmurs of agreement. Another officer added, "It's a parade vehicle, a peacetime symbol, not a warfighter." When the colonel flipped to images of the Soviet T-72, the room straightened with pride. Rugged, proven, built for shock assault. It was the backbone of Warsaw Pact ground doctrine, exported in large numbers. Familiar to allies, feared by the West, so they believed. They reviewed performance stats, armor sloping, low silhouette, gun stabilizer tolerances. Everything pointed toward battlefield superiority under real combat conditions. Simulated tests showed that in close to medium range, the T-72 could destroy any NATO tank, especially in numbers. And that was always the bet, numbers. Soviet strategy didn't hinge on one perfect machine. It relied on deployment in depth. Tank battalions in waves, coordinated assault. If a few were lost, others would press forward. U.S. technology might be better on paper, but war was about fatigue, terrain, and pressure, not theater displays. The briefing concluded with a familiar refrain. The Americans don't want to lose tanks. We don't fear that. They will hesitate. We will act. But none of them knew what was coming. No one in that room had seen thermal targeting at work. None had witnessed fire control systems calculate and strike at 3,000 meters without delay. They hadn't considered that visibility could be overcome with sensors. That accuracy no longer depended on clear skies or daylight. They assumed tank warfare was still a contest of angles and armor. And most damning of all, they believed the Iraqis, equipped with Soviet-made T-72s, trained by Soviet doctrine, and led by generals schooled in Warsaw Pact planning, would at least hold the line. The idea that those tanks might not even fire never entered the room. Soviet armored warfare doctrine wasn't built for elegance. It was built for overrun. Rooted in the devastation of the Second World War and refined in the decades of Cold War brinkmanship, it prioritized mass deployment, speed, and battlefield durability. The tank was not a precision instrument, it was a hammer. And the T-72 embodied that principle. First introduced in the 1970s, the T-72 was meant to be the people's tank. Cheaper, faster to produce, and easier to operate than the T-64 or T-80. It had a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun, automatic loader, and a low profile that made it hard to spot at range. Armor was layered but not excessive. The goal wasn't to survive everything. It was to be fielded in thousands and survive long enough. The doctrinal blueprint was simple. Soviet forces would deploy tanks in waves using their mobility and quantity to saturate and overwhelm. A U.S. prize unit might have better tech, but Soviet planners assumed it would be outnumbered, outflanked, and eventually crushed. If one tank failed, 10 more would come. If the enemy retreated, Soviet tanks would pursue. The battlefield was expected to be brutal, bloody, and decided by attrition, not precision. There was a second core belief. Engagements would happen at short to medium range. Soviet tanks were trained to fire accurately at 1,500 to 2,000 meters. Anything beyond that was theory, barely practiced, rarely emphasized. Targeting systems reflected this. The T-72's optical sights were limited. Night fighting capability was rudimentary. Thermal imaging was reserved for elite units or never fielded at all. And finally, there was the idea that tanks would always fight tanks. Combat was visual, immediate, tactile. You'd see the enemy. You'd maneuver, you'd fire. That's what generations of tank crews were trained to do. Close distance, use terrain, trust your armor. But in 1991, none of those principles held. The Americans had rewritten the playbook. They didn't wait to close, they didn't rely on sight. And they didn't fire to engage, they fired to erase. With the Abrams, U.S. tank crews could identify targets day or night at over 3,000 meters. Their fire control systems calculated lead angles, wind drift, and barrel wear in real time. The 120mm smoothbore gun, stabilized by a digital gyroscope and connected to GPS and laser rangefinders, struck with pinpoint accuracy while on the move. It didn't matter if the target was hull down or behind smoke. And this broke every line of Soviet logic. The T-72 was built to absorb return fire. But now, it was being destroyed before it could even see the enemy. Soviet armor was trained to survive flanking maneuvers, but now, destruction came head-on, from the front, from a tank it couldn't reach, in a fight it couldn't even begin. This wasn't combat. It was calculation. And Soviet doctrine, grounded in World War II momentum, was about to find itself facing a 21st century kill system. January 17, 1991, southern Iraq. The sun hadn't yet risen over the flat desert near the Saudi border when a reconnaissance element of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment spotted the first dust trails on the horizon. Through night vision scopes, they counted at least a dozen tanks. The silhouettes matched the Iraqi Republican Guard, likely T-72s or Type 69 variants, rolling north in standard wedge formation. Inside a lead M1 Abrams, the gunner leaned in, scanning through the tank's FLIR display. There was no ambiguity. The targets were real. The distance, 200 meters, far beyond the limits of most tank guns. But the Americans weren't waiting for range. They were watching for certainty. The tank commander gave the order. Fire! A 120mm depleted uranium shell left the Abrams barrel at over 1,500 meters per second, stabilized in flight by fins, tracked by a laser rangefinder, and calculated against barrel droop, wind conditions, and temperature by the onboard fire control computer. It struck the lead T-72 dead center, penetrating the upper glacis plate, armor that was once considered immune at range. The tank exploded before it stopped rolling. The entire exchange took under 4 seconds. Another Abrams fired, then another. T-72s were struck before they could unbutton their hatches. The Iraqi crews never saw muzzle flashes. Some tanks attempted to reverse. Others simply burned in place. In less than 2 minutes, 12 enemy tanks had been destroyed. None of the American tanks had been hit. The radio crackled with stunned confirmations. Kill confirmed. No return fire. Re-engaging. But the real impact wasn't on the battlefield. It came hours later, broadcast from a mobile CNN team embedded with U.S. forces. Grainy green thermal footage showed one T-72 turning in place as its turret was blown off, a column of flame spearing upward into the night sky. Another was caught mid-reverse, its engine deck splitting apart under kinetic force. There were no American voices in the footage, no drama, just silence, crosshairs, and sudden death. When this footage reached Moscow, it was played 3 times in a row in one operations room. Analysts couldn't believe what they were seeing. The engagements occurred outside of T-72 engagement range. No terrain advantage, no support artillery, no airstrikes, just tanks, killing other tanks from distances that by Soviet standards were physically irrelevant. It wasn't just the kills that shocked the generals, it was the speed, the silence, and the certainty. The event was immediately flagged for internal study by the general staff. The footage was real. The timestamps matched satellite observations. And most devastating of all, the units destroyed were believed to be Republican Guard armored battalions, equipped with the best Soviet hardware Baghdad had ever received. The Iraqis didn't break formation. They didn't panic. They didn't surrender. They simply ceased to exist. It was the first moment Soviet military observers realized they weren't watching a lopsided war. They were watching the rules of tank warfare being rewritten in real time. The first reports that reached Moscow were easy to dismiss. Official Soviet military attachés in Baghdad claimed early U.S. success was exaggerated. They cited poor Iraqi positioning, miscommunication between tank crews, and a temporary breakdown in radar coverage due to initial airstrikes. Some within the general staff quietly assured their peers that the real ground war hadn't begun yet. This was propaganda, a psychological operation designed to rattle the Eastern Bloc. But then the tapes started coming. CNN wasn't showing just 1 or 2 explosions. They aired back-to-back sequences of T-72s being destroyed without context, without warning, and without any visible American presence. Flame erupted through hatches, turrets were blown clear off chassis, and infrared views showed T-72s cooking from the inside out. No dramatic commentary, just mechanical death. And worst of all, it wasn't stopping. Footage from Desert Storm showed dozens of destroyed tanks over a 24-hour period. Satellite images confirmed mass armor losses along the Basra Road. Reconnaissance intercepted U.S. communications reporting engagements where American units suffered 0 losses while destroying full Iraqi armored companies. Still, disbelief persisted. A senior Soviet general reviewed the combat data and declared, "The Iraqis must be using export models, downgraded systems, no Contact 5, no modernized optics. This doesn't reflect real T-72 performance." That explanation held for a few days. Official statements pointed to the T-72M, a variant with less composite armor, simplified fire control, and no thermal imaging. The Soviets had never exported their best. Iraqi tankers were poorly trained. Their battlefield positioning was sloppy. Their doctrine, unrefined. A real Soviet armored unit would have fared better, they said. But new data quickly undermined the theory. Intercepted radio logs revealed that many of the Iraqi T-72s were equipped with modernized systems. Some even had reactive armor kits installed with Soviet advisors present during pre-war deployment. The formations followed proper defensive doctrine. Some were even dug into hull-down positions. It hadn't mattered. One U.S. battalion logged 28 kills in a single day with 0 mechanical failures and no losses. One American tank commander was heard saying, "We're not fighting tanks, we're clearing targets." Meanwhile, FLIR footage from embedded press units showed not only how fast the T-72s died, but how passive they seemed. None were maneuvering. None were returning fire effectively. In many clips, they didn't even fire once. At first, Soviet planners thought it was footage from drills or simulations. But when analysts overlaid the videos with satellite imagery, they matched down to the crater. The tanks were real. The deaths were real. And so the excuses began to dry up. In internal memos, the GAB-TU, Main Armored Directorate, quietly shifted language from underperformance to unexpected vulnerability. Intelligence branches stopped calling the Abrams over-engineered. A new term circulated inside classified files: engagement dominance, the ability to decide the start and end of battle from outside the enemy's reaction zone. It was a concept the Soviets had never trained for, and now they were seeing it play out in real time on public television, again and again and again. Faced with mounting evidence of catastrophic T-72 losses, Soviet analysts scrambled for a narrative they could believe and survive. The first explanation to gain institutional traction was simple, comforting, and fatally wrong. The Iraqis had failed, not the equipment. This narrative blamed everything on the user, not the machine. Internal communiques from GAB-2 repeated the same refrain. The T-72 platform remains valid. Combat results reflect improper usage, insufficient crew training, and failure to coordinate with support elements. In other words, our tanks are fine. They were just in the wrong hands. Soviet doctrine had always emphasized the human element in tank warfare. Crews were trained rigorously in combined arms operations, with emphasis on coordination, fire discipline, and terrain exploitation. The Iraqi forces, in contrast, were seen as a paper army, trained quickly, inconsistently, and often politically appointed, rather than professionally vetted. Reports highlighted Iraqi crews abandoning tanks mid-engagement, failing to relocate under fire, and refusing to use reverse maneuvers. Soviet observers noted open-top storage of ammunition, improper use of smoke dischargers, and failures to dig proper hull-down positions. To many in Moscow, the conclusion was obvious. The T-72 wasn't being used as intended. This theory gained traction quickly. It allowed generals to retain confidence in their own formations. Had this been a Warsaw Pact unit, one briefing claimed, American armor would not have advanced past the first ridge. The belief was that with competent crews, Soviet armor would never have allowed itself to be seen, let alone struck, from such long ranges. To reinforce this view, training footage from Soviet tank academies was circulated again through internal channels. Clips showed T-72s maneuvering under fire, coordinating with artillery and reconnaissance drones. The implication was clear. We train for war. Iraqis train for parades, but then something shifted. New satellite images revealed destroyed Iraqi tanks in defensive positions, exactly the type Soviet doctrine prescribed. Dug in, staggered, facing the correct direction. Some were even shown with reactive armor bricks and camouflage netting. Yet they were destroyed all the same. The footage from CNN told the rest of the story. These tanks never returned fire. American engagement logs showed most U.S. tanks fired first at over 2,500 meters, well beyond even upgraded T-72 optics. By the time Iraqi gunners identified the threat, they were either dead or disoriented. Some never even got a lock. Worse, internal KGB assessments began to question whether even elite Soviet crews would have fared differently. Their conclusion kept deeply classified. With current optics and targeting delay, The average T-72 would be destroyed before first fire, regardless of operator quality. That conclusion shattered the first theory, because if the machine couldn't see the enemy, the machine couldn't win, no matter who was inside it. When the bad crew excuse began to unravel, Soviet strategists doubled down, not by questioning the T-72's design, but by elevating the enemy's technology to mythical levels. If their tanks weren't failing because of user error, then surely they were being destroyed by something unfair, unsustainable, or impractical. Thus emerged the second wrong theory, that the M1 Abrams was a fantasy tank, fueled by unlimited Pentagon spending, held together by fragile technology, and dependent on pristine battlefield conditions. In short, it was a laboratory monster, unbeatable in clean tests, but too complex and expensive to win a real war. A new round of reports from Soviet military-industrial circles argued that the Abrams superiority came from sheer indulgence. No other nation, one internal white paper claimed, could afford to field gas turbine tanks with composite armor and uranium rounds on this scale. They pointed to the tank's 1,500 horsepower engine, which burned through jet fuel like a bomber. They calculated resupply burdens. They highlighted the weight, over 60 tons, which, they said, would trap it in soft terrain and limit maneuverability. The Abrams was labeled a logistical liability. The theory painted a seductive picture, that U.S. forces might win the first week, but their vehicles would soon grind to a halt from fuel exhaustion, mechanical failures, and the sheer burden of their own technology. Even some Soviet tank designers chimed in, suggesting the Abrams was too advanced, that its reliance on digital fire control, stabilized optics, and GPS systems made it vulnerable to disruption. If a single chip failed, they argued, the tank became blind. One report speculated that in a European theater with contested airspace and jammed satellites, the Abrams would be a dead horse in a golden saddle. This theory reassured many. It suggested that what happened in Iraq was a fluke, a result of open desert, air supremacy, and a pampered, over-engineered system operating in ideal conditions. But then came the Battle of 73 Easting. In this single engagement, fewer than a dozen American tanks encountered a fully deployed Iraqi armored brigade and destroyed it in under 30 minutes, in the middle of a sandstorm, in poor visibility, under active fire, no GPS signal, no satellite overlays, just crew skill and onboard systems. The Abrams advanced while firing. Its armor withstood return shells, its thermals cut through fog and smoke, and its rounds, especially the M829A1 depleted uranium penetrators, sliced through T-72s like they weren't even armored. Entire enemy formations collapsed before making visual contact. More importantly, not a single Abrams was lost. The fantasy tank theory died that day, not with a rebuttal, but with a kill count. For Soviet observers, this marked a terrifying realization. The Americans hadn't built an experimental tank. They had mass-produced a functional execution system, one that could move, shoot, and survive, without help, without excuses, and without error. It wasn't indulgence. It was dominance, engineered, tested, and deployed at scale. Behind the thick doors of a GRU analysis cell on the outskirts of Moscow, the mood was shifting from confusion to quiet dread. What had begun as a case study in asymmetric performance had turned into a full-blown recognition of failure, not on the battlefield, but in the intelligence pipeline itself. The Soviet Union had long prided itself on military-industrial espionage. Through a mixture of satellite reconnaissance, human assets, and signal interception, the KGB and GRU had tracked nearly every Western weapons platform since the 1950s. They had schematics of the F-4 Phantom before it entered full U.S. service. They knew the number of M60 tanks deployed in West Germany to the digit. But the Abrams had fooled them. Or worse, they had fooled themselves. When the M1 program began in the 1970s, Soviet intelligence labeled it another heavy tank experiment, similar to the American MBT-70, a failed joint design. Early prototypes lacked punch and were hampered by engine issues. Soviet analysts confidently predicted the project would be scaled down or abandoned. They were half right. The U.S. did scale the program, but into the M1A1, a platform that combined advanced fire control, composite Chobham armor, and a turbine engine with unmatched responsiveness. It wasn't a test bed, it was the future, and the Soviets didn't see it coming. Even more dangerously, the intelligence agencies misjudged the integration factor. The Abrams didn't just have better components, it combined them in ways the Soviets had never attempted. Their reports focused on the gun, the armor, the engine, but not the software. Not the real-time targeting interface. Not the digital ballistic computer that calculated a hit probability in less than a second. Not the stabilization system that let it fire on the move with near-surgical accuracy. The GRU never modeled these systems in tandem. Instead, they treated each as a standalone advantage, something that could be neutralized by terrain, weather, or tactical surprise. What they missed was that the Abrams wasn't fighting alone, even when it was alone. It was connected, not wirelessly, not via satellites, but through logic. Every component contributed to a single task: identify, engage, destroy. No redundancy, no delay. The result was what American doctrine called a hunter-killer loop. Commander and gunner could scan independently, lock targets, and assign fire solutions within seconds. The Soviets had no equivalent. The T-72's commander and gunner used the same optics, no separation of roles, no continuous scan, no fire-tracking memory. Even when Soviet analysts received leaked diagrams of the Abrams fire control, they didn't understand what they were looking at. The modularity seemed excessive, the computer too sensitive. They assumed it would fail under stress. And yet, in the chaos of battle, it didn't fail. It dominated. By early February 1991, a restricted KGB memo summarized the disaster in 2 words: predictive blindness. It concluded that the Soviet Union had failed to anticipate not just the Abrams hardware, but its role. The tank wasn't an armored cavalry spearhead. It was a precision first strike platform, one that saw first, fired first, and survived first. And Soviet intelligence had been looking at the wrong war the entire time. They prepared for massed assaults. The Americans had prepared for surgical destruction. To understand what destroyed the T-72 in seconds, Soviet analysts would have to face a brutal truth. The Abrams was never just a tank. It was a real-time mechanized fire control system on tracks, built not to compete with other vehicles, but to erase them before they could respond. The beating heart of the M1A1 Abrams was not its gun, nor its armor, nor even its engine. It was the integrated fire control system, a closed-loop network of digital sensors, processors, and targeting optics that turned raw battlefield data into near-instant kills. It began with the thermal imaging sight, a first-generation FLIR, forward-looking infrared scanner, that could identify heat signatures up to 4,000 meters away, day, night, fog, or smoke. Unlike optical sights, it didn't need light, color, or clarity. It saw only heat and motion, and it saw fast. The tank's laser rangefinder provided precise distance calculations with a margin of error measured in centimeters. That data fed instantly into a ballistic computer, which adjusted for range, air temperature, barrel wear, wind drift, and even the movement of the target. This entire cycle, detection to computation, took under 2 seconds. The result? When the gunner pressed the trigger, the Abrams didn't just fire. It executed a solution. And that round, most often an M829A1 silver bullet, depleted uranium penetrator, struck targets at velocities over 1,500 meters per second. These kinetic energy penetrators didn't explode. They punched, burned, and shredded, turning armor into aerosolized steel. Against the T-72's frontal plate, even with Contact 1 ERA, they passed through like a hot needle through canvas. Meanwhile, the commander had his own independent sight, the CITV, commander's independent thermal viewer, allowing him to scan for new targets while the gunner engaged the first. This hunter-killer setup created a continuous acquisition loop. Identify, engage, transition. No downtime, no confusion. And it wasn't just what the Abrams could see. It was what it didn't need to see. Thanks to GPS, inertial navigation, and tactical data radios, American tank units could coordinate without visual contact. A platoon could move as one, identify overlapping targets, and stagger engagements without speaking a word. Range rings, formation lines, and kill zones were plotted digitally before contact. The Soviets had trained for close-range ambushes and mechanical relays. The Americans had built a digital ambush system that extended far beyond visual range. They didn't flank with speed. They flanked with data. Even the Abrams' so-called weaknesses, its fuel consumption, its weight, had been mitigated by planning. Heavy logistics? The U.S. brought them. Fuel-hungry turbines? The U.S. refueled under fire. Complex parts? They had spares. Trained crews. Redundant support. The Abrams didn't win alone. It won because everything around it was built to let it win. Contrast that with the T-72. It lacked thermal imaging, relying on IR floodlights that were useless in daylight and dangerous at night. Its fire control was semi-manual. Its autoloader sometimes mangled shells. Its commander and gunner shared one optic. It had no GPS, no onboard map, and no stabilized sights during movement. At best, a skilled T-72 crew could hit at 1,500 meters, if stationary. At worst, it fired blind. And none of this was theory. It had played out in fire. At 73 Easting, at Medina Ridge, at Objective Norfolk, Iraqi T-72s were decimated before even acquiring targets. The Abrams wasn't a better tank. It was a different machine, designed for a different kind of war. One where range meant immunity. One where speed was measured in milliseconds to lock. And one where seeing first meant surviving forever. February 26, 1991. The Battle of 73 Easting. The fog was thick and blinding. Sand whipped across the horizon as a storm raged over the flat emptiness of southern Iraq. But the M1 Abrams tanks of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment didn't need sunlight. Their thermal sights burned through the storm like a scalpel. At 3:30 p.m., as the regiment crested a ridge, known only as phase line smash, they encountered the Iraqi Tawakalna Division, a Republican Guard armored unit positioned in defensive array. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, including the prized T-72s, sat dug in, hidden in berms, awaiting contact. They never got it. From over 3,000 meters away, the American tankers opened fire. Within 20 minutes, the front line of Iraqi armor had disintegrated. One T-72 was hit before it rotated its turret. Another exploded after its engine ignited, visible on FLIR as a glowing white plume. Crews abandoned hatches mid-strike, only to be consumed by secondary fires. Iraqi return fire was wild, ineffective, misaligned. Many never fired at all. In the aftermath, more than 160 enemy armored vehicles were destroyed. American losses? 0 tanks destroyed. 0 killed in action. The ratio stunned not just Baghdad, but Moscow. Because for decades, the T-72 was the workhorse of Soviet armored credibility. It had fought in Syria, Angola, Iran, and Afghanistan. It symbolized Soviet ruggedness. Easy to produce, fast to train, good enough to win. Warsaw-packed exercises had built entire strategies around its survivability. In East Germany, Soviet divisions prepared to push through the Fulda Gap with wave after wave of T-72s. And now, on global television, that myth was burning under infrared light. The footage from 73 Easting became emblematic. On CNN and BBC, the same sequence played. Black silhouettes bursting into white flashes. Turrets launched skyward. Infrared crosshairs locking without mercy. Tanks being destroyed in real time, sometimes before they even stopped moving. To the public, it was a victory parade. To Soviet officers, It was a mass grave. And worse, it wasn't just the Abrams. Bradleys, American infantry fighting vehicles with TOW missiles, contributed heavily to the kill count. Lightly armored, fast, deadly. In one stretch, a Bradley platoon destroyed a line of T-72s without taking a single return hit. That was the breaking point. In the General Staff back in Moscow, high-level briefings acknowledged what few dared say aloud. This wasn't an issue of crew or terrain or luck. It was doctrinal collapse. The U.S. wasn't fighting differently. They were fighting from another dimension of time, one where decisions were made faster than Soviet tanks could respond, where the first hit wasn't an advantage, but a death sentence. Every Soviet officer who had trained for a frontal push across Europe now faced an unbearable question. If this was what the Americans could do to a T-72 from 3,000 meters, what would they do to our T-80s, our T-64s, our BMP columns? There was no satisfying answer. Because at 73 Easting, the world hadn't just seen tanks destroyed. They had seen an entire military myth die on screen. A myth written in steel and fire, now ended in dust and light. What began as shock inside Moscow's war rooms soon became something much deeper. A strategic fracture, rippling through the foundations of the Soviet military machine. For over 3 decades, Soviet armored doctrine had stood as a pillar of Warsaw Pact strategy. It wasn't just a tactical model. It was an ideological banner. The T-72 and its successors were symbols of state power. Symbols of the belief that simplicity, mass production, and rugged design could overcome complexity and precision. The tank was more than steel. It was dogma. But now that dogma lay in smoldering pieces across southern Iraq. In the weeks following Desert Storm, Soviet allies began quietly re-evaluating their military purchases. Eastern Bloc nations who once relied on T-72s started inquiring about Western platforms. Even India, one of the largest Soviet arms customers, requested comparative tests between T-72s and British Challengers. Polish officers submitted internal assessments questioning whether their armored brigades could survive 15 minutes in a NATO engagement. Inside the Kremlin, the implications were catastrophic. Because if the T-72 failed, everything attached to it failed. The maintenance doctrine, the munitions logistics, the field repair protocols, the training sequences, the satellite support. Billions of rubles in infrastructure, decades of planning. All oriented around a system that could no longer survive in modern war. And worse, it failed on television. CNN had broadcast the defeat in real time to over 1 billion viewers. The myth of Soviet armor, once whispered in NATO bunkers and feared in German valleys, was now globally discredited. This wasn't a backwater loss. It was a prime-time defeat, with FLIR footage that left no room for interpretation. For the first time in Cold War history, the USSR didn't just lose in intelligence briefings or proxy battles. It lost in the public eye. The effect was corrosive. Within Soviet command circles, once proud generals found themselves unable to defend their systems. Memos turned from denial to damage control. Some urged emergency upgrades to optics and rangefinders. Others proposed pausing export contracts. A few pushed for full development of thermal systems, long dismissed as Western luxury. But all of it was too late. By the summer of 1991, reform-minded officers within the General Staff quietly acknowledged a forbidden truth. The West had pulled ahead, not just in weapons, but in warfare itself. Precision had replaced mass. Integration had replaced repetition. Technology wasn't a supplement. It was the battlefield. And the Soviet Union couldn't keep up. Its economy was collapsing. Its factories were strained. Its scientists were bleeding into civilian sectors or fleeing to Israel and the US for work. It could not afford the future it had just seen explode on a CNN screen. So when the T-72 burned, it wasn't just the end of a tank's reputation. It was the ideological collapse of Soviet martial identity. They had believed in the hammer. But war, it turned out, had become a scalpel. And no amount of armor could protect the myth once that truth was visible to the world. In the years that followed Desert Storm, the images never left. In dusty archives across Moscow, grainy FLIR footage was stored and replayed under labels like OP4 engagement analysis and thermal threat response. But no matter what euphemism they used, the truth always returned with each frame, black and white ghosts of T-72s caught in the crosshairs, then consumed by flashes of light. For the Soviet Union, which would cease to exist by the end of 1991, the humiliation of watching its proudest export annihilated on global television was not just tactical, it was existential. Because no regime can survive when it can no longer believe in its own myths. The T-72 had once been a symbol of dominance, a tool of deterrence, a machine meant to hold the line against NATO aggression. But Desert Storm didn't just destroy hundreds of them. It rewrote the narrative. The tank was now a symbol of fragility, of obsolescence, of a doctrine that belonged to the past, and perhaps more than anything, of visibility. In a war where seeing first meant killing first, Soviet armor was suddenly visible to everyone, from U.S. satellites to tank gunners to a family in Omaha watching CNN during dinner. The shroud of mystery that once covered the Red Army had been lifted, not by a spy, not by a leak, but by a battlefield that filmed its own truth. Today, the T-72 still rolls in parades. It appears in Third World Wars, in propaganda clips, in museum exhibits. But inside the minds of every senior Soviet officer who lived through that moment, a shadow remains. The memory of an empire's pride exploding in seconds, on live television, while they sat in silence. No speech, no counterstrike, just a blinking screen and a tank that vanished before it ever saw what killed it. And that silence, it echoes still. Because the Cold War didn't end with treaties or walls falling. It ended with a crosshair and a flash.